Welcome to the lecture for Module 6 on Marxism. In this lecture, we will define Marxism, look at some of the assumptions of Marxism as it pertains to international relations, discuss Marxist approaches and criticisms, and conclude with a concrete example of Marxism in practice. So to begin, and this is very important, Marxism in and of itself is not a theory of international relations, but in the context of this class, it refers to a group of Marxist approaches to international relations. So let's talk a little bit about Marxism first before going on to how it applies to IR. So one of the concepts associated with Marxism is historical materialism. This is the idea that humans and their relations are determined by material conditions. So instead of looking at ideas or the distribution of power throughout the international system, what Marxism does is look at which economic class people were in, and that explains the trajectory of human societies over time. Another aspect to Marxist ideology is what's called a dialectic, where you have a statement or idea known as a thesis, and then an opposing one called an antithesis, and then it reaches a new state of affairs called a synthesis. And so Marx uses this kind of approach over time to develop an explanation for why we see an evolution in the conflict that economic classes have engaged in since the advent, really, of human organization. Another couple of important concepts here are the bourgeoisie, or capital-owning class, and the proletariat, or the workers. And Marx argues that these two groups are fundamentally at odds with one another, where the capital-owning class continually work to exploit the workers or the proletariat, and that this will eventually lead to an overthrow of the capital-owning class in the name of greater worker uniting and also liberation from their economic position. Related to this is the fact that what these workers experience is a result of capitalism, and that it is capitalism that causes us to feel alienated from our work and even from each other. And it results in a false consciousness. That is, we think our lives are fine, that we're doing well, but we're actually further and further afield from true meaning and substance in our existence because capitalism is this cloak that sort of affects everything that we do in our lives. So those are just some basic elements of Marxism that foreground the assumptions that I'm going to talk about next. So the first assumption of Marxism as it applies to international relations is that capitalism and nation states are not natural or inevitable. These are the products of deliberate decisions that could be changed if workers were to decide to overthrow the bourgeoisie and decide to create a new future. This is something that I find a lot of students struggle with when thinking about how we can organize our societies in different ways. Capitalism is one of those conditions that students typically take for granted and that they couldn't envision society could be organized in any other way. Another assumption is that international relations is about more than just foreign policy. It's about things like labor, technologies, and survival, not of countries, but of people. Another assumption is that you cannot separate the political and economic spheres of life, whereas some of the theories we've covered more clearly find a separation between the two or prioritize one over the other. In Marxism, in international relations, these two are indissolubly linked, and so we can't extricate them from one another. Another assumption is to question what it is that is actually international about international relations. Of course, for Marxists, it is economic processes that are the main issue that drives international relations. And then finally, an assumption is that there are tensions between national and global aspects of capitalism. What might be good for a nation state might be bad for the global economy or vice versa, and these tensions create conflicts over time. And so instead of looking at, say, the distribution of material capabilities, we should be looking at the kinds of economic factors that are present in the international system, both at the level of the state and the international system. So there are three different Marxist approaches we're going to talk about here. One is world systems theory, which divides the world into three different kinds of countries. There are core countries, which are typically wealthy countries that exploit the poorer countries throughout the world and purchase their raw materials. There's the semi-periphery, which enjoys some of the benefits of the rich countries, but also tends to be still exploited by the core countries. And then there's finally the periphery countries, which are those that are the poor, exploited countries that provide the raw materials that go into making finished goods that are enjoyed by the core countries. There's also a neo-Gramscian approach focusing on the concept of hegemony, which involves 1, domination of some groups over other groups, and 2, dependency, which relies on different kinds of coercive and consensual relations. And so neo-Gramscian theorists believe that hegemony and dependency are the factors that really motivate what goes on in the international system. And then finally, there's historical sociology, which argues that the modern state system is defined most appropriately by economic processes rather than things like economic vitality or maximization or the distribution of material capabilities like realists believe. So some of the criticisms that have been lobbied against Marxism include 1, that it's too normative because it believes that we should undo capitalism and replace it with communism in eventually toward a more egalitarian state, and also that it is unable to explain why workers of the world have not united to overthrow the state and to create a different kind of future. One example of this that's very helpful to think about is migration. Who is considered a good migrant under national law and even international law has to do with their ability to contribute to capitalism, not because of their individual qualities. Unlike what other international relations theories allege, the domestic and international realms in the context of migration are fully fused together. In theory, we are all migrants of one or another. Most of us have come from some other place, or our ancestors have, to where we currently reside, but we have been treated differently depending on historical context, and that has a lot to do with the way that capitalism has perceived the utility of migrants throughout space and time.